Hi, I'm Chad with Move Forward Guitar. This lesson is from our course Music Theory 1. All the lessons for this course are free on our YouTube channel, so you can follow right along with the playlist, or you can look in the description below for links to the rest of the lessons. To accelerate your learning though, I highly recommend that you download the corresponding workbook and eGuide. To learn more about the workbook and eGuide, click the link on the screen or look in the description below. Welcome to Music Theory 1, Lesson 8. In this lesson, I'm going to talk about scales. So now we're going to talk about scales, and this will also show you one of the reasons why intervals are so important. But first, I just want to define what a scale is, and then we'll really dive into it. And a scale is just a series of notes ordered by pitch. And that probably doesn't mean much to you. If I was reading that, that wouldn't mean much to me. So I'm really going to dive in and explain that. So the first thing to understand is that a scale has a starting point, and that's called the tonic. And whenever I show a tonic, I'm going to represent it in red. And I'm starting with an A right now, but it doesn't matter what I started with. I'm just starting with A to make it simple, and because it falls on a nice place on the fretboard. The actual notes that I'm using aren't too crucial right now. So a scale starts on the tonic and just goes up to that next note an octave higher, and that's still called the tonic. If I was to start on A, that'd be the first note I started with in the scale, but all of the A's would actually be a tonic of that scale. So if the scale is going from its starting point, the tonic, to the octave, and we fill in with notes in between, and that's a scale, that means the most notes that you can have in a scale is 12, because again, in Western music there are only 12 notes. And actually, if we were to fill in every note, you should be able to see that I've mentioned before, this is a musical alphabet, but it's also a chromatic scale. So if I was to start on any note, I started on A just to make it simple. A is my tonic, and I played every single note until I hit the next A an octave higher. I've just played an A chromatic scale. If I were to start on C and play every single note until I hit C again, I'd be playing a C chromatic scale. Again, the note we're actually starting on is just a random note, but we've made A our tonic just to keep it simple. And one of the reasons intervals are so important is because scales are just built by intervals. And so an A chromatic scale is just built by half steps, which are your smallest intervals. So every note from one note to the next is a half step apart, which I mentioned was a minor second interval. So a chromatic scale is just taking the smallest interval steps that you can until you hit its octave. So all scales are built by intervals. And that might be kind of confusing when we're talking about chromatic scales, since we're talking about every single note that you can play. So if we look at the major scale, which is actually the most important scale to understand in Western music, I think it'll be a little easier to understand how a scale is built by intervals. Now we're really going to dive into the major scale in the next course because, like I said, it's the most important scale to understand in Western music, which means it's the most important scale to understand for understanding music theory. But I don't want to really dive into why that is right now. Just understand that, and understand that I'm going to really dive into it later. But I do want to use the major scale as a reference to explain more about scales in general. So now I've just moved to the fifth string, and I've started with a C to a C, which would be a C chromatic scale if I was to play that from C to C. But what I want to talk about now is the C major scale. So again, to build a scale, you just start with your lowest note, which is your tonic, and then anytime that note repeats, it's a tonic again. But just think about the lowest note as your starting point, which is your tonic. And we'll talk more about tonic in an upcoming lesson. I just want you to get used to that term. And just for now, realize that it's the starting point of the scale. To build a major scale, we just use different intervals. And the formula to build a major scale is whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step. So that would mean that I start on my tonic, I go up a whole step, I go up another whole step, then a half step, then a whole step, then a whole step, then a whole step, and then a half step, I'm back at the tonic an octave higher. And that, for the C major scale, would give me C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. And I started with C because C is the only major scale that doesn't have any sharps or flats in it, so it's just a little easier to say the letter names and to visualize for now. So this is a C major scale on one string, and you can see that it's 7 notes. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. This C is just an octave higher repeating of your first C. So the major scale is 7 notes. Doesn't matter what note you start on, what note is your tonic, it's always 7 notes, and it's always built with the same formula. Whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, half step. And that's just on one string that I showed you to keep it simple, but then that would just repeat over the whole fretboard. So this is a C major scale over the whole fretboard, at least the diagram that I have drawn here. And it's just the notes C, D, E, F, G, A, B repeated over and over again over the fretboard. But of course, like I mentioned, you have unison notes, so it can make it a little confusing when you're looking at it vertically. But just realize a major scale, and we're talking about the C major scale right now, would just be those specific notes repeated over and over again. And it wouldn't matter what note I started with. If I started on A and made that my tonic, and I applied the formula whole step, half step, whole step, half step, I would end up with an A major scale. So the A major scale is A, B, C sharp, D, E, F sharp, G sharp, A. And the way I found that is I just started on A, my tonic, went up a whole step, went up a whole step, then a half step, then a whole step, then a whole step, then a whole step, and then a half step back to my tonic, which is an octave higher. That gives me these notes. And then I would just put that over the whole fretboard. Those notes repeated over the whole fretboard. I'd have the A major scale on the whole fretboard. And so the reason this is built with intervals is because the intervals just represent the distances between all the notes. So from A to B is a whole step, which is an interval. And then there's an interval of a whole step, an interval of a half step, and so on. It's just built with whole steps and half steps. But you also look at it representing all the intervals from your tonic. So from this A to a B is a whole step, which is a specific interval. It'd be called a major second, but don't worry about the interval name for now. We'll talk about that in the next course. And then from A to C sharp is a specific interval, which is 2 whole steps apart. That'd be called a major third. A to D is 2.5 steps apart, which is a specific interval, and so on. So all these intervals, the names that you would come up with these intervals, are relating back to your tonic, which was your starting point and your ending point. So all scales are just built with intervals. I just gave you the most important scale to understand, which is the major scale, and these are the intervals of the major scale. But like I said, I'm going to talk about the specific names in the next course. I just want you to understand how scales are actually built, and they're built specifically with intervals. Now, I've mentioned that the major scale is the most important scale in Western music. I've mentioned that multiple times just to prove how important it is and how recognizable it is, meaning, and the reason it's recognizable is because you've heard it so much in Western music. I'm going to play the C major scale on one string, and you're going to recognize the sound right away if you're familiar with Western music. Now to prove my point even further, I'm going to play the scale slowly, but I'm going to hesitate on the B before I resolve it back to the C, and you're going to be able to hear this note and want to hear this note as I'm pausing on this note, because if I don't resolve it to this last C, it's going to sound incomplete. You'll actually, I'm sure, be able to hear what the next note is supposed to be and probably even be able to sing it or hum it. So that was just a little demo to really drive in the fact that the major scale is so crucial to Western music, and it's going to be really recognizable to you. And the reason it's recognizable is because you've heard it so much, because most of our music is coming straight out of the major scale. And there are many other scales besides the chromatic scale or the major scale, which we'll talk about in other lessons. But again, those scales are just built with intervals as well. And they start with the tonic and then go to the octave, and the notes in between, which are built by intervals, represent what that scale is. But again, don't worry about those for now. Just think about the major scale for now. And so far I've talked a lot about scales in this lesson, but you still may be wondering what the point of a scale is. I didn't talk about that yet purposely because I wanted to talk about how they relate to intervals and how they're built first. All songs, chords, harmonies, melodies come straight out of some scale. And in Western music, they're typically coming out of the major scale. There can be songs, especially more complex music like jazz, where they're using a bunch of different scales to build complex harmonies and melodies. But for most popular music that you hear, it's going to be based out of the major scale. So for example, if I play the melody that I played you earlier from that really simple melody that I created for that song, every note that I played came straight out of the G major scale. Again, to build a G major scale, you'd start on G, make that your tonic, and then go whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step, and then you'd end up with G, A, B, C, D, E, F sharp, back to G, and then that would just repeat all over your fretboard. That's a G major scale. And that melody I played came directly out of the G major scale. I played G, F sharp, A, and so on. You can watch the video and watch where my fingers are moving. And I played in this area of the neck. And then all the chords I played for the actual chord progression came straight out of the G major scale as well. I played a G chord, and you can see a G chord shape right here. Hopefully you can see that if I circle those, that's just a basic open G chord. And then the same for all the other chords. Those chords are just using notes straight out of the G major scale. I'm just playing chords as harmony, so it means that I'm playing more than one note at a time. And then the other melody that I played on top of the first melody came straight out of the G major scale. It's just notes straight out of the G major scale again. And then if a singer was to sing over this chord progression, they'd be singing notes that are coming straight out of the G major scale. If I was to improvise or solo over this, here's an example of that. Again, I'm just using notes straight out of the G major scale. So most popular songs that you hear in Western music are just taking the major scale and building the harmony and melody straight out of the notes in the major scale and not even going out of it. Some songs do, they can go and switch out of the scale for a bit. The Beatles would do that all the time. A lot of popular music doesn't. More complex music, like I mentioned, jazz, can switch scales all the time. But in general, you can think of it as taking one major scale and using all the notes within that major scale. And here's an example of what it would sound like if I played outside of the G major scale over that chord progression from the song. You can hear when I hit some of those notes which land in between the G major scale notes, they sound really off. Now you can get away with this, and it's called playing chromatics. When you're talking about more advanced music like jazz, it happens all the time. Jazz uses a lot of chromatics, but it has to be done very specifically, and you don't land and rest on those notes. You would still rest on the notes that are coming from the main scale that you're playing out of. So again, if you're talking about scales, the importance of them is that any note that you play or sing, any chord that you play, any soloing or improvising that you do, those notes are going to come out of some sort of scale. And in Western music, the most common scale is major scale that you'll hear those notes come out of. So scales are the basis for all songs. And we'll really dive into this in upcoming lessons. This is really just an overview of what scales are and why they're important. Don't think that you have to really be able to use this in a practical sense yet. And just a quick note, I've been talking a lot about the major scale. Another really common scale that you'll hear in Western music is called the minor pentatonic scale, or there's the major pentatonic scale, and then the blues scale, which is just the minor pentatonic scale or major pentatonic scale with an extra note in it. There's a lot of music built out of that, and the blues is totally based out of the blues scale. But the pentatonic scales are really just taking notes, 5 of the 7 notes out of the major scale. So they're just taking 5 notes from the major scale to create a different scale. But we'll talk about pentatonic scales later. Just be aware that you'll hear the pentatonic scales a lot, the major and minor pentatonic scales in Western music as well. But those are really just coming straight out of the major scale. So that's an explanation of scales. In the next lesson, I'm going to talk about chords. Look in the Music Theory 1 workbook for step-by-step guidance on how to retain this information and what to do next. And remember, all the charts and diagrams are in the Music Theory 1 eGuide for you to reference anytime.